Resident Evil is one of the most notable franchises in gaming history, spanning nearly 25 years of innovation and having its own midlife crisis with 5 and 6, as well as some other apparently bad ones, leading to the beginning of a new era for Resident Evil itself. And with the release of the Resident Evil 3 remake a week ago, I thought it'd be fun to take a trip down memory lane and review all of the modern Resident Evil titles, which include 7, 2 Remake, and 3 Remake. Now you might be asking why I would be reviewing these 3 games together rather than separately, and why I might be doing it in this franchise specifically. Well, dear viewer, they were all similar enough in content and mechanics that reviewing them as individual products would be redundant, as well as doing it in this format makes it a lot easier to see what they each do right and what all of them do wrong. And also my college closed down for the semester, so I wanted something that would keep me occupied long enough to not completely lose my mind, but that didn't really go as planned. So let's just jump in with the most recent of the series timeline, but the oldest of these 3 games. Resident Evil 7 was advertised as a grand return to the series' survival horror roots after the lackluster middle portion that this franchise suffered, or at least that's what I've heard. When it was unveiled, it was speculated that this game would give players what they've wanted for years: traditional Resident Evil. Upon its announcement, the Resident Evil Beginning Hour gameplay demo was released, as well as Kitchen, the VR tech test. Tech test was just a dev's way of trying to make you shit yourself with a toaster on your face, but Beginning Hour is something unlike anything I've ever experienced before. Beginning Hour would go on to have 2 updates, first being the Twilight update in September, and the Midnight update in December when it was released to Xbox and Steam. Unfortunately, the Twilight and original versions of the demo are no longer easily accessible, but the content from those demos were only added onto in the following updates, apart from the phone calls that would give some details into the grand narrative. This is without a doubt the most unique release I've ever seen for a demo. Normally, demos are only updated to add a purchase page to the game, not to add content onto the demo itself. People speculated what would later be explained in the coming updates, and it helped generate buzz for what Resident Evil 7 would actually be like. Now, upon looking at even the most normal of gameplay for this demo, you may notice some of the demo's inspiration, most notably the hallway to the entrance of the house. Now, I know the originality argument is sort of a touchy subject nowadays, with people spending hours of their time trying to explain why guns and colors don't make things twins, but I can't help but point out that Beginning Hour and PT are similar, if for no other reason than their genre. It's honestly not even a bad thing, because the similarities are merely an homage to PT, and quite frankly, this was the only noteworthy alternative after the shit show that was Konami's dealing with the project. Horror in its truest form was barely registering during both of these releases, so after PT's initial launch, it only made sense to capitalize on its controversy. The demo itself is quite simple. You are Clancy Javis, a ghost hunter who has come to the derelict house to record a show, and now you've been kidnapped by the inhabitants who were thought to be long gone. You have one goal: get out of the house. You're left to your own devices without the game explaining anything to you. And just when you think you've beaten the demo, it hits you with an end card that says you got the bad ending, implying that there's a good ending. And this is where the magic of Beginning Hour is revealed. You're expected to replay the demo and delve deeper into this world, uncovering new mysteries about what's to come in the full game. Those who invested lots of time into this demo were rewarded, not only with content and story in the demo, but with teases and even unlockables for the full release. My favorite part of this demo is the story that is revealed in the attic, revealing a small story about 5 children who met their end in the Baker Mansion. Beyond the horrifying child murder, the story is great because of its additional story content that is intriguing because of its unexpectedness. Unlike most of the files in newspaper you come across, the story isn't trying to make sense of the world, but add a story in an engaging way. All of this concludes with a cut to black screen that tells you about the full release, talks about the early access Patreon thing, and sends you back to the home screen. And honestly, I really like this demo. The best thing that it took from PT was subtlety and knowing how to be reserved. Both of these games do what horror should do: keep the player informed enough to know how to progress, but uninformed enough to keep them scared at what lies in the darkness. Which is ironic, considering the full release is about as subtle as a rocket launcher. Speaking of which, the reason I'm covering these demos separately from the games is due to how each game is represented in these demos. Beginning Hour represents itself as a horror puzzle game, one that has minimal combat and more of an emphasis on environmental storytelling and replaying the game multiple times to understand and progress through it. The full game is not like this at all. That's not to say that none of these elements are there. In fact, each of them is there, but none of them are properly showcased in this demo. Combat is here, but it's much more of the focus than what is shown in the demo. There are puzzles, but most of them are laid out clearly or don't require the player to go too far out of their way to solve it. It is a horror game, but the scares come mainly from knowing what you're up against and the dread of not having enough resources to survive, rather than shitting yourself due to someone spooking you. Though don't worry, that's here too. It's worth mentioning that even though this game isn't what was initially expected, it's still very good in its own right. It is a return to the survival horror that this game established for itself, and the first-person perspective does wonders to enhance its effects. Through a lot of the encounters, you'll be shooting enemies, preferably in the face, or maneuvering around them to avoid fights to conserve resources, or you'll try and block your way through it like a bitch, but we'll get into that in a bit. The aiming in this game is somewhat unique to most other titles, barring the ones in this franchise. See, rather than auto-aiming with the accuracy of a Navy SEAL, you're just a regular person, one who has to steady their shot before pulling the trigger. You have to be making shots that are guaranteed to hit, and that requires you to wait and aim rather than run and hide. And considering that your opponents take multiple hits to put down, you're going to be getting up close and personal with the ugly slug monsters. This mechanic is so effective that Capcom has used it in both of their following titles, which makes sense considering a mechanic like this probably took a while to develop properly. Now, this system alone would make the game damn near impossible if it wasn't balanced out with a way to defend yourself from oncoming attacks. Fortunately, the game solves this issue with blocking, allowing you to either block yourself from an attack or take significantly reduced damage. It's usually pretty consistent in what it does, unless you're attempting to block in boss fights or special encounters, but those areas are usually not designed for you to be able to block attacks, but rather dodge them in the environment, so it's somewhat excusable. Another way that this game manages to keep you on your toes is the survival part of the survival horror game, in which you scavenge around the manor for supplies to keep you alive. You'll be scavenging weapons, health, ammo, and upgrades throughout your journey, and it's easily the core aspect that makes you think before going into each encounter. You're never going to be comfortable enough to power through without at least preparing for every new encounter, and the game actively discourages you from doing so with its save system. Gone are the days of autosaving before every doorway. This game requires you to save in safe rooms scattered throughout the house. Here, you can save items that you've gathered along the way, contemplate your strategy, or take a breath before going back into the hellscape that surrounds you. Though I should mention that this system is almost entirely shattered upon a second playthrough, considering you'll know where your enemies are and how to deal with them most effectively. But then again, when you're going through the game on a second playthrough, your focus isn't the same type of survival that it is in the first. For all Resident Evil games, the first playthrough emphasizes learning the environment and preparing for every encounter, whereas subsequent playthroughs emphasize knowing where and when to stop to achieve the lowest time possible. I was going to talk about the boat portion of this game, considering that's kind of a slog to get through, but I think they might have updated it or changed something in it because I got through that section in less than 10 minutes. So if anyone has played the game before, probably the DLCs, that's why I didn't bring it up. The final system in this game that keeps it firmly in the survival horror genre is a system I like to call the Tyrant system, and in this game that comes in the form of Jack. Now I'm classifying Jack as a Tyrant enemy because he serves the exact same role as a Tyrant, pushing the player towards their objective after they become complacent in their surroundings. He will roam around specific parts of the level that the player has by this point become well acquainted with, and act as a form of hurdle that the player will overcome. It's a really ingenious system, and it's one that makes you change how you play in a way that's more natural than scripted sequences. There's obviously other systems in this game that aid in making it an immersive and terrifying experience, but I can't say anything about them beyond this made me change how I play, so let's just move on. I'm going to be honest, I've been sitting here for like 30 minutes trying to think of a transition between this segment and the next one because I'm bad at those and I can't write a joke about how Southern families scare me. So let's just talk about the Bakers now. Now, looking at this game's cast of characters, it's pretty clear to see where a majority of the developers put their time as far as writing and the script is concerned. Don't get me wrong, the side characters and the other main cast aren't bad in their own right, but when compared to the Baker family's portrayal and performance, I'd be hard-pressed to say that Ethan I Don't Know How to React Properly Winters and Jack Baker exist on even the same spectrum of both acting and attention. Jack's performance is easily the best in this game, as his lines and overall impact on the story makes him easily the most developed character in the game, and unfortunately, the same can't be said for Ethan, the guy you actually play as. He's not the worst one of the cast, but the problems in his performance are the same as the worst of this cast, namely the lack of direction for scenes in which the on-screen viscera is not represented in the delivery of the lines. I mean, Clancy whimpering while literally being burned alive were mocked relentlessly online, but Ethan isn't much better in this department. I mean, Ethan gets stabbed in the intro like 5 times, one of which goes straight through his goddamn hand, and his reaction sounds more akin to him throwing a really heavy garbage bag away. It's just so confusing because later on, he gets stabbed in the same hand, yet he screams out in pain, which is also the same scream for when he dies in the full game. Why didn't you put this in the scene literally 4 minutes before it? You're clearly not opposed to reusing audio clips, considering that his death scream is repeated, and also in the same section where he gets his hand chopped off. It bears mentioning, especially considering that the cast, barring Ethan, do a significantly improved job in the DLC, so I feel like the acting problems wasn't a result of the actors, but rather the direction they were given. But nonetheless, Jack Baker is the absolute star of the show in this regard. Compared to most other characters in this game and in this franchise, very few of his lines have an awkward delivery, and it feels like the actor is having a genuinely fun time in his role. And it's never inconsistent in how he's portrayed throughout the entire game. He rides the line between completely corrupted and the family man that he was before he became deranged, and the scene towards the end of the game cement him as the star of this cast. I think the developers noticed this one in development, considering that they gave him 3 fucking boss fights in this one game, and 4 total with the end of Zoe included. Honestly, I wish that the game didn't like Jack Baker so much, because him showing up as much as he does is just annoying after the 3rd time you see him. He turns into that annoying relative at a family gathering who won't take the fucking hint, and then he shows up again just for the hell of it. And the ironic thing about all of this is that his boss fights are the only good ones in the game. Marguerite's fight is more disgusting than it is challenging, and Evelyn's is so scripted that I got bored of it on my first playthrough, which is not something I think you want from your final boss. Speaking of Marguerite, I think that she's actually really good alongside Jack, as her lines perfectly capture a southern mother, weirdly wholesome and absolutely terrifying. I also think her performance gets slightly better in the banned footage DLCs, even though she straddles the line of a psychopathic killer about as well as Lucas does, but her performance is solid and her writing is pretty good to boot. What isn't good about her character is her very odd face posing during cutscenes. Now, I don't want to pick on the designers because I actually really like this game and I think that they've done a phenomenal job, but I can't help but look at Marguerite in cutscenes and think that this could have been handled so much better. It applies to all the characters here, including Jack, but it's at the absolute worst with Marguerite. Specifically during her section of the game, her lip syncing just doesn't align with what's actually being said 90% of the time.
Where do you think you're going?
This might have been a bug or some weird design choice, but all of the DLC for the game has been released and it has not been fixed at all, so I guess I'll just have to grin and bear it. I guess the consolation for this effect was that it made her more creepy, even though that's not what I think the intention was when looking at her. In all honesty, these aren't things that actually bother me all that much, but I find that these are the things that they can improve on in future installments, as they've openly said that Resident Evil 8 is planned. But I don't think that this is what they should focus on fixing in the next installment. Instead, I think they need to focus on one of the additions they've made to the universe. Now, one thing that I didn't entirely understand upon playing this game again was how Mia was written, specifically her dialogue and the way that she's portrayed. I get the fact that Evelyn was controlling Mia from the very beginning, but so much of both what she says conflicts with what Evelyn wants, but not in the way that the writers intended. It's like they wanted to commit to having Mia be a vessel for both herself and Evelyn to communicate through, but maybe it didn't work out or things got changed so that couldn't be the case, so instead they're separated in the actual game, but Mia's lines never got changed to fit this. The intro of the game has Mia stab Ethan, throw him into a wall, stab him with a screwdriver, cut his hand off, and tries to cut him in half with a chainsaw, with the scene before this talking about how they can now be a family since Ethan is here. It's like they wrote a draft of the script, started making the intro, scrapped half of it, and didn't bother to fix the changes they've made in the new one. On top of that, you have the morality choice 2/3 into the game, in which you either choose to save the psychotic bitch who has tried to kill you nearly every time she's seen you, lied to you about her work and where she's been before the game started, dropped off the face of the earth for 3 years, and seemingly came back to kill and capture you, preferably in that order, or the nice southern lady who has been the only one to help you throughout this entire journey. And here's the funny part about all of this: Zoe isn't the canon ending. It's not even a choice that can be either or. The DLC specifically says that Mia is the correct choice for you to make, despite not giving any reason for this to be the case whatsoever. Now my theory about different drafts being smashed together should start to make sense, especially due to how both of them end during the boat. If you pick Zoe's ending, she dies before you even reach a ship, and Mia is teleported to the ship for her section with no other explanation beyond Evelyn is a monster. After this, you go through the entire boat segment as usual, and at the point where you start to play as Ethan again, there's a fight between the two as Evelyn has finally taken control over Mia. After all the work you put towards trying to save your wife, someone who you thought was dead for 3 years, she gives in to Evelyn and now you are the one who has to kill her, despite everything you've done to try and save her. Or that's what the game wants you to think, but comparing this intro and Mia's general bitchery through the game, I felt more annoyed that this was the thing that they forgot to take out of the game. Mia isn't someone we've known for several years or built a connection with. She's shown in like 4 different scenes of the game and none of them are in a pleasant light. She is dodgy and murderous, and the game starts off with her admitting that she's lied to you for years, and yet we're meant to feel attached for her without the game giving us a damn reason for it. This isn't a fucking damsel in distress, it's a twist villain that doesn't even have the decency to go anywhere. You could have fixed this by having some type of flashback where Ethan remembers Mia when she wasn't infected and was actually a human being. I get that you're trying to keep this game as grounded as possible, but Ethan already has a hallucination in the game when he enters a mold, so it's not out of the picture that him and Mia could have had a similar trip in the game. And also, it's fucking Resident Evil. Nobody plays this game for how realistic it is with its goddamn canon, especially not in this game, so you can get away with doing things if it services the story in a meaningful way. The canon ending isn't even any better. In that one, Mia just pushes you out of the room and seemingly dies to Evelyn before coming back in the final cutscene of the game. You either take the ending where you seem psychotic for doing it even though it's the right one, or you take the sane person ending and you're punished for it by plot holes, contrivances, and inconsistent character development. And honestly, that's the biggest problem in this game. The game is at its absolute best when it's laser focused on the Bakers and their interactions with Ethan, but everything involving Evelyn and Mia just makes it such a confused and contrived mess that it isn't even worth trying to solve. Every single resolution that you can draw from it is rendered completely pointless due to the fact that the writers couldn't commit to a narrative. It wants to make sure that this game connects to the overall narrative of Resident Evil's universe, but it doesn't fucking have to try this hard to do it. You can write a story about psychos in a mansion without completely breaking the laws of science and psychology, and it won't inherently be bad. You already have Chris Redfield showing up at the end because of Evelyn, so why the fuck include Mia at all? The biggest problem I have with this game is that it doesn't want to commit to one story, so it just throws shit from every other game to try and make a story that can make for some last minute explosion, like every fucking Resident Evil game, apparently. I really do like this game. I know I just railed on how bad the writing falls apart when you look at it with glasses on, but that wasn't my focus when I played it for the first time. On my first playthrough, all I could see was how fleshed out this game's systems were, how completely different the combat was from anything I've ever played, and how I was glued to my chair despite being so terrified on everything that was happening in front of me. Even after playing this game 3 times and doing more research into this game than I ever wanted to, I still find myself getting spooked at this game's best scares and grossed out at its most disgusting moments. I will never get that fucking wasp crotch out of my brain for as long as I live, I swear to God. I like that the game doesn't hold back its difficulty even when it makes you more powerful than the monsters it throws at you, because that feels earned. It's rewarding to have a game recognize the effort you put in and give you something to commend your achievements, which is something that I think this series does really well. I like Aunt Rhody, even though this game uses a song so often that it replaces any other theme that this game could have. I think this is a really great starting point for those who want to get into survival horror titles, as it strikes the right balance of accessibility and ease of access while also being challenging and emphasizing the survival part instead of the horror. But even though I think this is the best starting point, the next game is easily the best in its genre. Being that my introduction to the series was Resident Evil 7, the remake of Resident Evil 2 did not trigger the same emotional reaction as those who had grown up with the game. What I saw to be a new Resident Evil game was something longtime fans had seen and played years before I was even born. It was the reinvention of something that people loved, and unlike some titles that I've personally experienced the reinventing of, this one is actually good. Resident Evil 2 Remake released on January 25th, 2019, with its 30-minute demo releasing 2 weeks prior. And unlike beginning our release for Biohazard, this was an accurate representation of what the new release would be like, down to the introduction of its characters, new items, goal for the first act, and combat mechanics. And as much as I like beginning hour for the nightmarish escape room that it is, I can say that the impression that it left was accurate to the final product. On the other hand, the 30-minute demo encapsulated exactly what the beginning of the game was going to be like, on top of tying off the demo with a tease for the rest of the game. This demo does what any good demo should do: give the player a proper impression of the product, provide enough content to satisfy those who played it, and give those who experienced it an edge over those those who did not. It's something that I think all of these games do really well, be it introducing mechanics that take a while to understand and master, showing them placements and secrets for items inside the game, or give players an idea of what to expect in each area. This demo got me, as well as many others, excited for the remake, and it'd be such a neat and happy ending had the demo ended with its fade to black. But no, it felt the need to end with a smash cut trailer of all the interesting events that would happen throughout the rest of the game, from the dumb alligator fight, which isn't very important, to spoiling not only Mr.X, but also the boss fights and major characters to the story. Now, like I said, I never played the original game, so I had no idea who any of these people were in the grand narrative that is Resident Evil 2, but after playing the entire game 4 times over, I can't fathom why Capcom would release a trailer that so heavily spoils major moments of the game, especially with how important Mr.X is in this game. You took inspiration from PT by making a short experience that unravels the more you dive into it, yet you forgot to take what PT did well and show some fucking restraint for your own game. You literally made your demo 30 minutes long so people didn't uncover your secrets before the full release, only to spoil it anyway on your own. Think about it, how much better would the reveal of Mr.X be if it was when he lifts the helicopter and not in a fucking trailer trying to get you to buy the game? This is even present in the E3 trailer from 2018, where past the release date there's actually a huge fucking spoiler for the story. Here's a tip for any developers who make demos like this. If the player reaches the end of your demo and hasn't already closed out of it, they're most likely already interested in your game. You don't need to shoot yourself in the leg just to rope in players, and especially not for a game that is based on twists and keeping you on your toes. I guess my biggest problem with this reveal is how well done the rest of the game is, that I wish it was marketed better, which is something that this, 7, and 3 all have issues with. I just don't get it, but I guess I'm also not a game developer, so who knows, maybe this did help break in that 5 million units sold for this game's lifetime. Beyond its marketing, this demo showcases the game incredibly well, and those who wound up playing this demo and continued on to the full game would not be disappointed, and would no doubt go to enjoy the game as much as I did. As far as gameplay is concerned, this game sticks to the core 3 tenets that made up Resident Evil 7, with combat, survival, and altering the gameplay to keep the player on their toes. You might have noticed that this one is in first person, but don't get too scared, the two games control nearly identically. Shooting is the same, looting is the same, and the puzzles aren't anything new for Resident Evil. The main difference between these two games is the methods they use for the player to avoid damage. In Resident Evil 7, this was done with blocking, and in this game, it's done with something called sub-weapons. Throughout the RPD, you'll be picking up your standard ammo, weapons, and healing supplies, but on top of that, you'll also be picking up knives, flashbangs, and grenades. While in combat, you have the choice of using it as you would a knife or a bomb. When you get grabbed from head-on in this game, there's a brief window where you can use one of these items to save yourself from taking damage. You can either use it and save your health, or take the hit and save the item for a future encounter, and in concept and practice, this is a perfect system. Rather than removing the choice from the player, it gives them multiple choices that dynamically affect how they interact with the world. You're either breezing past one location of the map or completely rerouting yourself in order to avoid taking more damage. You're also dealing with the intricacies of inventory management, in which choosing what items take priority becomes part of the gameplay itself. Honestly, the only place where the system fumbles is in the final area, where the only way to survive getting grabbed by an IV monster is to have a sub-weapon in your inventory. Granted, this is also the literal end of the game, and the IV monsters are relatively easy to dodge and kill here. It just pales in comparison with how well it's implemented in the rest of the game. That being said, reaching a tier set somewhere in the cosmos doesn't make it a death sentence for this game. It's just one mechanic that's somewhat lacking. However, this game has bigger fish to fry than just herbal remedy zombies, and if you played the game or caught them while I was bitching about the advertising, you already know what's coming next. After the first Tyrant reveal towards the end of the original Resident Evil, Capcom decided to release the sequel with him in mind as a genuine presence rather than a cameo. When the original Resident Evil 2 released, it had 2 storylines that could be played back to back in the form of scenarios. Scenario A was a much easier experience as there was no Tyrant to follow you around the map. However, in Scenario B, the Tyrant appears in order to throw the player off in gameplay, thus making Scenario B a challenge despite you knowing the general layout. This isn't something I've experienced though, but it's something that I've learned from researching the original, so take it with a grain of salt, but Tyrant was nonetheless a surprise because games didn't do anything like this before. It's what makes him unique, the fact that he is a presence that people didn't expect in second playthrough and didn't know how to defeat immediately based on what they already knew. And even though Mr. X is now a presence in every playthrough, be it A or B, I still feel that this implementation is to be commended. He comes in at a point of the story where you're finally beginning to get comfortable traversing the RPD, only to completely sideline you and put you back on your toes. He will chase you through nearly every room of the station, requiring you to change how you interact with each of the rooms and which pathways to pick due to where he is at any given time. He's easily the best of the tyrant system of these three games, and even in Scenario B, when he shows up at a different place to throw you off much earlier in the game, it's that much more terrifying because now you're less complacent than you would have been. His presence after the RPD is dependent on which person you play as he is either around until the bitter end and becomes the final boss fight for Leon, or he gets killed by Birkin before you even enter the sewers. Now, this is an interesting dynamic to have, however, it's completely ruined by one huge flaw in the story. Resident Evil 2 follows the story of two protagonists, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. They meet up, head to Raccoon City, only to be separated and forced to split apart and meet at the police department. Depending on who you play, your Scenario A character will arrive first, with Scenario B arriving around 30 minutes later. At that point, you're meant to believe that both Leon and Claire are running around the RPD, solving puzzles and popping bullets and zombies, but never actually meet up. This is even more egregious when you consider the story that both of them follow. Let me lay out each campaign for you and see if you spot some of the problems. Leon arrives at the RPD, finds the spade key, interacts with Claire, retrieves the 3 tokens to open the secret passageway under the statue in the lobby, fights Birkin 1.0, meets up with Ada, goes back to the RPD to retrieve circuit pieces to open a cell, breaks a ladder, puts out the helicopter fire, meets Mr. X, opens a cell, opens a gate to the garage entrance, crawls in a sewer, gets shot, explores a sewer, solves a chess puzzle, fights Birkin 2.0, rescues Ada, reaches the nest, opens up every pathway in the nest, meets Mr. X in the labs, fights Birkin 3.0, drops Ada in a hole, fights Tyrant, gets on a train, and done. Claire arrives at the RPD, interacts with Leon, opens a gate, explores the RPD, finds the 3 tokens to open the secret passageway, fights Birkin 1.0, finds Sherry, gets attacked by Chief Irons, explores his office, goes back to find the circuit parts to open a gate, puts out the fire, meets Mr. X, opens a gate, goes to an orphanage, gets attacked by Mr. X who dies in front of her, ends up in the sewers, solves a chess puzzle, fights Birkin 2.0, gets Sherry, enters nest, places Sherry in a room, opens every pathway in the nest, fights Birkin 3.0, watches Annette die, evacuates on a train, fights Birkin 4.0, train, done. Now these two stories wouldn't be bad on their own, but they're made so much worse considering the fact that they're supposed to happen at the same time and in the same places. I don't think many people would care about puzzles or certain items being moved around or replaced, considering that a second run should be different enough to keep you on your toes, but events that are directly tied to the story should remain the same. Having you fight Birkin all 3 times on each playthrough, and apparently a resurrected Tyrant at the end of the game, just makes no sense, and that's even for the no-holds-bars experience that is Resident Evil. Now, while I was thinking about this problem in my haze of writing this until tomorrow's sunrise, I found a simple solution that would leave the game in a much more grounded state. Split the boss fights between the 2 players. First run players could encounter Birkin A and Birkin C, and the second run can fight Birkin B and their respective final bosses. Think about this for both Leon and Claire's story. If we play Leon A, Claire B, the intro to the sewers is the same, but rather than having to fight Birkin B in the exposed hole in front of the RPD, we go straight to rescuing Ada in the trash compactor. We continue as normal, fight Birkin C, and head down to the elevator without the Tyrant fight. Sure, the overall campaign is shorter, but that leaves surprises for second run, therefore making it more valuable. In Claire B, you would still find Sherry in the labs and continue to the orphanage as usual, watch Mr. T get ripped in half, fight Birkin B in the sewers, rescue Sherry, skip Birkin C, save Sherry, then Annette can leave to go shoot Ada, you continue down to the train, fight Birkin D, and then the game is over. For the inverse of Claire A and Leon B, Claire A begins as normal, you fight Birkin A, you can even have the orphanage sequence be the same, just don't have Tyrant show up to chase Claire. His presence isn't even needed here, considering that Birkin is the one that sends you down the elevator shaft anyways. Continue as normal, you fight Birkin C, then you get the scene with Annette dying, then progress down to the train yard and leave. For Leon B, fighting Birkin A has no story implication beyond big scary guy coming, so there's nothing to stop him from going straight to the parking garage. To progress normally, you fight Birkin B, you would skip Birkin C, and instead of Annette spilling the bees, Ada can just double-cross Leon at the bridge, as Annette doesn't trigger the meltdown that ends up breaking the bridge. You continue down to the bridge, fight Super Tyrant, then get on the train. Granted, some things might not line up with what this story is trying to do, but splitting it this way both incentivizes the play of second run, but also seeing what the inverse playthrough would be like, since you clearly want players to experience both full runs of the game. I understand that game development takes a long time and production for a game this big must have been tight, but I honestly feel that splitting splitting it up this way would be much more efficient for development as well, at least from a story perspective. I get that your story is already super convoluted and these remakes are already changing a lot from the originals, but you should make sure that the narrative inside the single game is consistent so that everything outside of it doesn't have to shift around just for it to make sense. Now, in all fairness, this design choice didn't really stick out to me when I was playing the game initially, so it's not something I would hold against the game, but in retrospect, I wish that the game was more consistent, especially considering how much it got right. This is survival horror at its best, and while the story definitely shot itself in the foot, the actual tales of Leon and Claire are some of the most enjoyable of this generation. Seeing how different people are affected not only by the outbreak but by Umbrella and everything that connects the two is something that I appreciate being able to experience. It makes me wish that I grew up with the series, being able to experience the expanding narrative alongside everyone else. But for being the game that sold me on Resident Evil, I wish its story made any sense in the form of continuity. I get the joke of nothing ever fucking dies in these games, but besides you fighting a bunch of enemies that keep showing up again, I wish that the story had enough differences between the two to facilitate being two runs. Annette fucking dies in both scenarios, making it pretty much impossible for her to do either of the other options in scenario B. The rooms magically repair themselves despite them being pretty clearly destroyed after boss fights, and fighting the same bosses in the same places with no context isn't logical. There's so much shit that you have to do in order to make this experience cohesive, and doing so isn't very worth it in the first place. All that being said, this was the game that sold me on survival horror. It's easily the best in a market of survival horror imitators like Outlast and Layers of Fear, because even though those games can be scary with jump scares and Jesus, they lack the content that makes them truly horrifying. Which, even though I can't describe it properly, it's something that this game and Resident Evil 7 have in spades. But what about the greatly anticipated Resident Evil 3? After all, that's the whole reason I decided to make this review, so it's about damn time that we finally delve into what the newest installment has in store for us. When I first played the demo that was released for this game, it was exactly what I expected this game to be, Resident Evil 2.5 with a more open space to explore. This demo didn't do anything out of the ordinary besides introducing its new gameplay changes. Sub-weapons are gone and are now just your standard grenade, flashbang, and pointless knife, and instead you're treated to this pointless button mashing segment and dodging. Now, I've played the demo and the full game for an extended amount of time, and I still have no idea what this is meant to do, and that's something that's going to come up a lot. It's never explained in tooltips or anywhere in the menus as far as I'm aware, and it's completely fucking pointless because spamming it doesn't do anything to save you from getting chomped on. My best guess is that it's meant to cut down on the long animation for when you get jumped, but if there's a fuller explanation than that, it's lost on this dumbass. I will say that after learning how dodging works and its parry-type timing mechanics, it definitely got better for me. It doesn't make its implementation any less shit, considering that there's no explanations for it in-game beyond press button do thing, but it's something that's better with time and practice because understanding that it's implemented more like a parry than a dodge makes the game a lot easier to process. There's honestly not a lot to say about this demo without further context. It's exactly like RE2's demo where you go through one of the first segments of the game and you're cut off before the next big story beat. You're introduced to Nemesis, then you watch a smash cut trailer that isn't as bad as the one for RE2, but still shows some things that I wish could be a secret, especially since they're not that important in the game. But I'll bitch about the story in a little bit, so for now I just want to point out that Capcom have reused the same bolt cutter animation for the past 3 games, and at this point it's stuck out in my mind as a thing that I will remember these games by. It's not that big deal in the grand scheme of things, but this made sense in the first one considering that you're fucking opening it with your actual arms. But in the following games, it's just a floating pair of bolt cutters that are also off screen, so what's even the fucking point? I don't actually care about this a lot, I just wanted to talk about it because it's the one thing that's stuck in my mind about these games, so let's just move on. Now, I hate the phrase subverting expectations, as that is a phrase that has been used to death by brainlets and morons, but I can't think of a better phrase to describe the first hour of this game. Compared to both RE7 and RE2, I would say that this game's introduction leads more towards 7, as it builds up the coming conflict, though I wouldn't say that either do a great job at subtlety. The introduction doesn't begin with zombies right out of the box, it begins with a live-action news segment with some of the worst timing I've ever seen in a video game.
This pandemic has spread faster than any disease in modern history.
After that, we play as Jill in first person, walking around her apartment until she gets a phone call, then boom, fucking garbage bag cosplay pops through the wall and chases us through the apartment building in a big spectacle action set piece with little input from the player beyond just keep pressing forward. Now, I didn't mind the flashy, artificial QTEs as much as some people will, because I knew going into this game that it was less survival horror and more action focused. I did my research, I know what I was getting into before I bought it. It's a pretty standard introduction, setting up the story and general premise before it murders Life Jacket Brad Vickers. You have some more QTEs and story events until you reach a subway, and now you're free to roam the open world of the currently on fire Raccoon City. All in all, the intro didn't bore me, but it didn't excite me either, considering that the QTEs took about as long to fail as a self-transcendence 3,100-mile race, and are about as interesting to do as that race sounds. Once we get to the subway station, though, things are more open and natural, and only 20-odd minutes into the game. I get that all Resident Evil intros are pretty long, considering their runtime, but given that both RE7 and RE2 actually let you explore and find things in the prologues rather than just follow narrow corridors, should explain the drop in quality of this particular introduction. I don't mean to get down on the game so early, but I found all the pre-rendered cutscenes too much for my liking, considering that there's no meaningful gameplay in these sections anyways. The demo area is here in full force, with some items switched around and added, but enough of it being the same that makes the demo rewarding to play because now you know where to go. But once you go back to put out the fire in the alleyway, things start to get a little weird in a big way. In the demo, you encounter Nemesis walking out of the bakery, and once more when you actually put out the fire. In the full game, he's not here. Or there. In fact, there's a sizable amount of time between him getting shot with a rocket and him punching through another wall. God, that guy really fucking hates walls. After that, he really feels like a wild card, and that really impressed me about the first half of this game. Every turn you make could lead to another encounter with him that you have to survive, and unlike Mr.X, this fucker really has it out for you, and he's packing the heat to murder your ass properly. He's got the tentacle monster things that aren't really threatening, wide swinging attacks that can hit you from even a distant range from him, and the ever obnoxious tentacle that acts more like a Spider-Man web slinger than an octopus leg. All this together, including the fact that his recovery time is a lot shorter than Mr.X's, or at least it feels like it, and you've got a mini-boss that's actually really threatening, and one that lives up to the name Nemesis. In this first hour of the game, I was having the most fun. Nemesis is kind of OP, but considering that that's the entire point of the game, I didn't really mind. This game is supposed to kick your ass, and considering that he's one of the only real threats to your life, it was nice to have him around in this hour. Problem with him being one of the only threats, though, is that he isn't the only threat, and that's where the game gets kind of fucky. Around halfway through the game, you'll encounter a few new variants of Umbrella's nightmares, same as the last game. You'll encounter the zombie dogs and lickers ripped straight out of the RE2 remake, to the new abominations like the disgusting spider monsters and hunters. Now, as far as implementations go, I think that most of these are pretty good. Most of them are location-based monsters, and for their time in the game, I don't have many issues with most of them. Lickers are still way too overpowered, but there's only like 3 rather than 13 cramped in a hallway. You also have Boulder Punch for that section, which isn't as useful as dodging, but serves the same purpose, so it gets a pass. What doesn't get a pass is the hunters in the Spencer Memorial Hospital. Apart from ripping off every piece of horror media with its introduction, it's easily the most broken enemy in the entire game. I might hate the lickers from RE2, but at least those had a fucking counter and they actually died when you shot them enough. Here, the fucking hunters are damn near impossible to kill unless you waste a grenade on them. Maybe I'm playing the game wrong and it's actually really easy to kill them when you know what you're doing, but every time I died from them, the text block that says, "Here's what you did wrong, fucko," would always disappear before I had the chance to read it. Real first world problems, I know, but for a game that hides valuable information in these screens, it'd be real fucking nice to read it so I know what I'm doing wrong. And even then, these fuckers are stupidly overpowered because of how they attack. From what I've been able to gather, they have uncancelable, unblockable 3 to 4 hit attacks that are high damage, high recovery, and also happen when they're stunned with flashbangs. Having one of these is bad enough in a game that's meant to be challenging, but having all 4 of these in a cramped room with 2 of them is fucking insanity. This gets better in more open areas, as they're no longer absolutely ruining my experience with the game, but this doesn't even come close to excusing the fact that they can still attack when they're fucking stunned. Games are fun when they're challenging, but the best part about challenging games is that there's usually a way to avoid damage in most, if not all, encounters, and it's up to your inputs to do that. Every single death I had in this game was due to things that were out of my control. I died 9 times in my first playthrough, and for a game that's meant to be challenging, it's pretty fucking annoying how polished its mechanics aren't. I was insta-killed by a wall of fire that I was pushed into, wombo-comboed by enemies that have multiple high damaging attacks, clipped on geometry, and my personal favorite, getting one hit by an enemy with half or full health despite having no way to block their attacks. I'm not going to be a bitch and say that it's the game's fault, but as someone who knows what they're doing in these games, I think that me dying should be because of me being dumb, not the game making me look dumber than I already am. Sorry, I like relatively balanced game design, but I guess you shouldn't have made the last one more polished than one of those fucking tinfoil balls. Unfortunately, there's still something in this game that bothers me more, but before we get to that, let's get into the guy that's on the fucking front of the game. While I was writing this review, one of the biggest criticisms I've seen from more credible reviewers than I is a Nemesis argument, and how despite him being on the front of the box and on the title, they describe him as not being around all that much. It's not a one-to-one picture, but I know exactly what they're getting at when they say it. Compared to the original game, Nemesis is more of a scripted enemy and boss fight than he is a constant threat. And yes, that goes against how I described him in a previous segment, but he's only like that for the Raccoon City portion of the game. After that, it's boss fights and cutscenes for the rest of the game, and that in itself is a substantial step back for this game. I think that this is what many people are describing when they talk about Nemesis, because he's exactly what Mr. X was like in the original RE2, a contextual enemy that appears in different portions of the game, but never for very long and only usually to advance the story. It's ironically the reverse of the remakes as it is for the originals, where Mr. X is the highlight of RE2, and Nemesis just kind of takes a backseat approach in his own game. And that'd be fine if his name wasn't on the box, but it is, and his execution is kind of annoying. It's honestly baffling how a game that has him front and center only features him for maybe an eighth of the game's runtime, and instead we're meant to focus on things that aren't him. Maybe if Nemesis was anywhere near as involved as Mr. X was, I wouldn't have that many problems with the game, because the actual thing that makes this game unique is at the forefront of my thoughts, rather than what the story does and how it makes me really upset. Let's go back to the intro for a quick minute and recount what happens in more detail. The game starts off with Jill having a nightmare. As she walks into her bathroom, she finds herself infected with what she assumes is a T-virus and watches herself transform into a monster in her very own eyes. She realizes that if she turns, she'll end up exactly like the brain-dead zombie she's faced in the Spencer mansion, and decides to take her own life rather than become one of those creatures. She jolts awake from her nightmare and wakes in Raccoon City on September 28th, only 5 days before she planned to leave Raccoon City for good. If you look at her notes throughout the apartment, you can see that she's actually incredibly paranoid about the Spencer Mansion event and is worried about being a carrier for the T-virus. She's obsessing over it, to the point where she's having stress dreams about it and writing her will to some unknown party, presumably Chris or Brad. That, on top of being ordered to stay in her apartment by the chief of RPD, she starts to go absolutely crazy. It builds up to a story that can tell about the struggles with the T-virus, her own trauma from the Spencer Mansion eating away at her and causing her to misjudge what's actually happening in front of her, and with the threat of Nemesis, it can be elevated to a story that makes her connection with Nemesis much deeper than just... But you know what this game does with that? Fucking nothing! Jill is completely fine throughout her entire journey, and the only part where she isn't is when she's infected and incapacitated for half a day. Why the fuck would you start a story about paranoia and the dangers of letting your mind spiral if you weren't gonna fucking build on it? The fever dream she has after she gets the vaccine doesn't count either, because the focus of that is her inability to shoot Carlos because she cares about him, not about the actual virus itself. It could have been him bleeding from a wound, non-hostile, and begging to be shot, kind of like he already is, and it wouldn't have changed the message one bit. And even then, she doesn't even seem all that bothered by it when she wakes up. And this was the thing that bothered me most about this game. Beyond the stupid frog fuckers, beyond the shitty dodge mechanics, and even beyond the QTEs and emphasis on action over big spookies, this is the thing that bothered me the most about Resident Evil 3 Remake. Jill Valentine is a great character, and I'm not saying that it's her character that's a problem, but it's just how fucking ridiculous the scale of everything is in this game, and it doesn't affect her at all. The intro sees her getting thrown at a wall, blasted out of a building, grabbed by the fucking head and thrown into a burning building, smashed through the goddamn floor, bashing her way through a door, seeing her goddamn partner, who is the only friendly face she's seen thus far, get infected and abandoning him, and then driving a car off of a fucking building while outrunning Slugface McAnti-smoking ad, and she's completely unfazed by any of this. Maybe it's just me, but if I were chased out of my apartment by a fucking Goliath after already being paranoid about a virus, only to realize that the virus is now where I live, I'd at least need a fucking breather before figuring out what to do next. And then again, I guess all that character development in that breath would probably be overshadowed by the fucking building collapsing or derailing a train, so I guess we wouldn't want to stop that from happening, now would we? And that's totally fine if you don't want to focus on story and characters. Games like that do exist. Superhot and Tomb Raider exist for a reason, but why the fuck would you try to double back and try to add story beats if you're not going to capitalize on it in any way? I was really excited to see how Marvin and Kendo were going to be involved in the story, only to see them both in their respective scenes and get really fucking annoyed that they were just cameos that could have been in the environment rather than have so much time put into them. Marvin gets bit by Brad and then fucking dips out of the story completely, which is the same problem that people already had with him in RE2.
Where'd that cop go? Don't know, don't care. We got a job to do.
Kendo just says hi and leaves, so why the fuck would you add these people if you weren't going to do anything about it? Jill Valentine is a badass, that's fine, but there's a lot of space between being a badass and being a damsel in distress. Ellie from The Last of Us isn't a damsel in distress, but she isn't a fucking Doomslayer either. She's in between as an actual human being. This game is writing a lot on familiar faces and fancy new graphics, but a part of moving a game from the 90s into today includes making the story not be total dog shit. Carlos doesn't look like a stereotypical Latino, isn't made of Legos, and actually has a character arc, even though it begins and ends at Umbrella Bad, so why couldn't Jill get the same treatment? In fact, I think that Jill is actually worse in this game because until he says it out fucking loud, she doesn't realize that he's part of UVCS, even though it's visible on his goddamn arm from the first scene in the game. If I noticed it on a first playthrough and saw it for 5 fucking minutes straight, I think big brain Jill Valentine should be able to see it as well. She saw people who were watching her from across the street, why can't she see the same logo that she's been staring at for weeks on end? So yeah, Jill gets infected towards the end of the game, but she doesn't react like someone who's been obsessing over a virus for weeks. She just goes, oh, and fucks off for half of a day. Why? I get the developers were probably really busy with remaking this game into a cohesive narrative and developing Resistance, but when you change so much of the story and events and don't bother to see if it makes sense, I kind of get distracted by the neon warning signs and the metric fuckton of mistakes in the story. Maybe I'm just not that knowledgeable about the original Resident Evil 3 and the overarching fuckstorm of a narrative, but considering how much this game seemingly wants to act as a reboot more than a remake, I think that someone should at least read it over once before it's actually published. From what I've been able to tell, many people view Resident Evil 3 as a disappointment, and while I don't agree with their why, I definitely agree with that sentiment. The main argument I've seen against this game is that it isn't as scary or focused on the survival horror aspects as RE2 was, and a shift towards more action-focused gameplay was something that they didn't expect. Thing is, the original RE3 wasn't focused on horror either, and it was much more action than scares in that game as well, so that criticism is kind of moot in the grand scheme of things. And considering the demo did its best to highlight combat over pissing your pants, I think Capcom did a good job in showing that this game isn't that scary. What I think Capcom didn't do well, in my very subjective opinion, is the way they handled the narrative and story of this one, and honestly of these 3 games in general. Resident Evil has some fucking wacky lore, probably the weirdest I've personally seen since this fucking mess of a storyline. And I get that it's probably like walking through a minefield to adhere to all of its rules, but I can't, for the life of me, understand why these developers won't put more time into their story and make sure that it makes sense before they release their next installment. I know that there's a lot of complications in trying to make a narrative that interweaves between a billion different events all at once, but from what I've been able to gather, you fucking got it right the first time, so why try and deviate so much if it's just going to cause you problems later on? Yeah, the mechanics in all of these games are stellar, but I'm one of those fucking losers who cares about the story of video games too. So why is it that every time I try to engage with it, I just get shit on? Capcom has so many great starts to their stories in these games, and each of them can span an entire game of their own. A wholesome southern family turned cannibals and murderers, 2 unlikely people uncovering secrets that would turn the world on its head, or a woman afraid that she's going to become the very abomination that she's sworn to destroy. Every time I wanted to be invested in the story, it was quickly shot down because mechanics of the game didn't blend with how the story works. Stories and mechanics should work in tandem, not detract from each other, and I can't honestly think of any place in any of these games where one enhances the other. You don't have to give me a boss fight every hour if your story's worth sitting through, so just make a good story and save yourself the time. But what do I know? I only spent 3 weeks of my life reviewing 3 games only to tell you that they're all good if you don't try to think about it too deeply, in a game that rewards you by thinking deeply about it by slapping you in the face and ignoring your questions. I get why people like Resident Evil and the survival horror genre in general. After playing these games and ones like it, I can definitely say that I'm a fan of horror games, even some of the bad ones. And as far as survival horror games go, I can say with certainty that this series has some of the best that this genre has ever had. I have no doubt that some people will dismiss my opinions because how I experience the game doesn't align with how they experienced it, and I think that's fine. I didn't make this review just for people to like me, I made it to express my perspective on all of these games and to explain improvements I think that the series should make moving forward. I love Resident Evil, and despite the fact that I've spent all of this time railing on the game, I will continue to go back into this world, if only because it is a showcase of what modern horror should be. It's no doubt as influential now as it was when it first released, and considering that this is only the first of what we can expect, I'm genuinely excited to see what the future holds for this series. Hello, I'm Snoozr. and thank you for watching my video. As far as debut projects go, I wanted to start off with something that I've wanted to do for years, and I felt that this would be the perfect time to do so. This won't be the only type of content here, as reviews are something I'm more interested in than invested in. That being said, I will continue to make these types of reviews if the occasion arises. I already have scripts done for Jedi Fallen Order and Modern Warfare from last year, so I guess we'll just have to see where those end up. As for right now, I just wanted to say hello. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and hopefully I'll be seeing you guys very soon.
Sherry's unconscious.
I have the antidote, if I give it to her.
Claire, what's happening?
Not now. Come on, Cherry, wake up. Wake up. Please wake up. Claire? Where am I?
It worked!
Oh, Sherry, you're gonna be okay. Thanks, Claire.
It's over.
No. I have to find my brother.
You're right. This is just the beginning.